The fog that descended upon London during the third week of November 1895 was of that peculiarly dense variety that transforms the familiar streets of the metropolis into something altogether more sinister. It was the sort of fog that muffled footsteps, distorted voices, and seemed to press against the gas lamps like some living thing seeking entry to the warm circles of light. On such nights, the respectable residents of Mayfair were inclined to draw their curtains tight and trust that morning would restore the world to its proper proportions. It was precisely such a night when the impossible occurred at Thornfield House, the narrow Georgian residence at No. 23 Wimpole Street that had stood silent as a tomb for the better part of 5 years. The voice that should not have been. At 17 minutes past midnight, 3 separate witnesses heard what they would later swear was the clear, educated voice of a woman calling from the upper floors of Thornfield House. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell, returning late from her sister's residence 2 doors down, paused with her latchkey in hand as the voice drifted through the fog-laden air. "Arthur," it called, distinctly and with what Mrs. Hartwell would describe as a note of desperate urgency. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch through the muffled silence, "Arthur, please, not again." Constable William Meadows, making his rounds along the Marylebone Road, heard the same voice from his position near the corner of Wimpole Street. The sound was so unexpected that he stopped beneath a gas lamp and consulted his pocket watch, noting the time with a precision that would later prove invaluable. Most significantly, Dr. Marcus Pemberton, who maintained a practice 3 houses away and was returning from a difficult berth in Fitzrovia, heard not only the voice but observed a brief flicker of light in the second-floor window of Thornfield House, a window that had remained dark for years. The voice belonged, by all accounts, to Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the widow of Colonel James Whitmore, late of the Indian Army. Mrs. Whitmore had not spoken a single word to any living soul since the night of her husband's funeral 5 years prior, when she had dismissed her staff, withdrawn from society, and retreated into a silence so complete that her few remaining servants communicated with her entirely through written notes slipped beneath her door. The morning's grim discovery. When Mrs. Fairfax, the elderly housekeeper who attended to Mrs. Whitmore's minimal needs twice weekly, arrived at her customary hour of 9 o'clock, she found the front door unlocked, itself an unprecedented occurrence. The house maintained its usual sepulchral quiet, but something in the quality of that silence struck the housekeeper as profoundly wrong. Mrs. Whitmore was discovered in her private sitting-room, seated in the high-backed chair where she spent her days reading and maintaining her correspondence with various charitable organizations, the only connection she maintained with the outside world. She appeared at first glance to have simply fallen asleep over her morning letters. Her writing desk was arranged with its customary precision, her pen lay beside a half-finished note to the Foundling Hospital, and her reading glasses rested upon the bridge of her nose. It was only when Mrs. Fairfax approached to wake her mistress for the morning tea that she observed the thin trickle of blood that had stained the front of Mrs. Whitmore's grey silk morning dress. A single, precise wound had been delivered directly to her heart, a thrust so accurate and delivered with such surgical precision that death would have been instantaneous. The locked room, Dr. Harrison Blackwood, summoned immediately by the distraught housekeeper, confirmed what the scene suggested. Mrs. Whitmore had been murdered sometime during the night. The wound, he observed, showed a knowledge of anatomy that suggested either medical training or considerable experience with edged weapons. Yet the circumstances of the crime defied all logical explanation. The sitting-room door had been locked from the inside with the key still in place. The windows were securely latched, their catches undisturbed by any forcing. A thorough examination revealed no hidden passages, no disturbed furniture, and no sign that any struggle had taken place. Most puzzling of all, no weapon could be found anywhere in the room, or indeed, anywhere in the house. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, arriving within the hour, found himself confronting a mystery that seemed to mock the very principles of criminal investigation. Here was a woman who had spoken to no one, yet 3 witnesses had heard her voice in the night. Here was a victim murdered in a room that remained locked from within by a killer who had apparently vanished into thin air. The contradictory evidence. As the morning progressed and the fog finally lifted, several curious details emerged that deepened rather than clarified the mystery. Upon Mrs. Whitmore's writing desk, alongside her charitable correspondence, lay a single sheet of paper that had not been there during Mrs. Fairfax's previous visit. Written in Mrs. Whitmore's careful hand were the words, "He has found me at last. God forgive us both." More intriguing still was the discovery of a gentleman's glove. Expensive leather, well made but showing signs of recent wear, tucked behind the cushion of Mrs. Whitmore's chair. The glove bore no identifying marks, yet its presence in a house that had received no visitors for years presented another impossible element to an already baffling case. In the fireplace, the ashes showed traces of recently burned paper, though the fire had been cold for hours. And upon the window-sill, barely visible unless one knew where to look, was a small smear of what appeared to be red clay, a substance entirely foreign to the London streets, yet somehow familiar to those who had served in Her Majesty's colonial territories. By noon, with his investigation yielding more questions than answers, Inspector Lestrade found himself standing outside the familiar door at 221B Baker Street, his pride warring with his professional duty. The case of the widow who spoke to no one had become, in the space of a single night, a puzzle that demanded the unique talents of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. For if a woman who had maintained perfect silence for 5 years had indeed spoken in her final moments, then to whom had she spoken, and what terrible secret had died with her in that locked room? The November afternoon had settled over Baker Street with that peculiar greyness which seems to press against the windows of London like some persistent visitor seeking admittance. In our familiar sitting room, Holmes occupied his customary position before the fireplace, his long fingers manipulating a series of chemical apparatus with the absorbed concentration of an artist at his canvas. The air was thick with the acrid smoke of his shag tobacco, mingled with the sharp odor of whatever experimental compound currently claimed his attention. I'd been attempting to organize my case notes when the familiar, heavy tread upon our stairs announced an arrival. Inspector Lestrade appeared in our doorway, his usually composed features bearing the unmistakable signs of professional frustration. His coat remained damp from the morning fog, and I observed with interest the fine coating of reddish clay that adorned his boots and the lower portions of his trousers. "Ah, Lestrade," Holmes observed, without lifting his eyes from his beakers. "I perceive you have spent your morning in Wimpole Street, where you have encountered a locked room mystery that defies conventional explanation. The particular shade of clay upon your boots is distinctive to that area of Mayfair, imported some decades ago for ornamental gardens. Your expression of baffled irritation, combined with the way you repeatedly clench your left hand, suggests a case that violates the fundamental principles of criminal investigation." Lestrade paused in removing his coat, his mouth falling slightly open. "How in blazes did you— Elementary observation, my dear fellow. Pray, take the chair by the fire and tell us about Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore and her impossible murder." The inspector settled himself with the resigned air of a man long accustomed to Holmes's uncanny insights. Drawing forth his notebook, he began his recitation with professional precision. "The facts are these, Mr. Holmes. Mrs. Whitmore, widow of Colonel James Whitmore of the Indian Army, has lived as a complete recluse for 5 years following her husband's death. She spoke to no living soul, received no visitors, and communicated with her minimal staff solely through written messages." Holmes finally looked up from his apparatus, and I recognized the gleam of intellectual curiosity that indicated a problem worthy of his attention. "Last evening at 17 minutes past midnight," Lestrade continued, 3 separate witnesses heard her voice, calling from the upper floors of her residence. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell, Constable Meadows, and Dr. Pemberton all heard her distinctly call Arthur twice, followed by, "Arthur, please, not again." This morning, Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper, discovered Mrs. Whitmore dead in her private sitting room. The nature of the wound? Holmes inquired, his chemical experiments now entirely forgotten. Single thrust directly to the heart, delivered with surgical precision according to Dr. Blackwood. Death would have been instantaneous. The peculiar circumstances, however, render the crime seemingly impossible. The sitting-room door was locked from the inside, key still in place. The windows were securely latched, showing no signs of forcing. No weapon could be found anywhere in the house, and there were no signs of struggle. Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "What additional evidence did you discover?" "Several curious items, Mr. Holmes." Upon her writing desk lay a note in her own hand. "He has found me at last. God forgive us both." Tucked behind the cushion of her chair, we found a gentleman's glove. Expensive leather, well made, left hand. The fireplace contained ashes from recently burned papers, though the fire had been cold for hours. Most puzzling, we discovered a small amount of red clay upon the windowsill, the same type I apparently tracked in, though how it came to be there remains a mystery. "The glove," Holmes said sharply. "Describe it in detail." "Size 7.5, showing recent wear but no identifying marks. The stitching suggests quality manufacture, though there are signs of amateur repair work." Holmes stopped his pacing abruptly, fixing us both with an intense stare. "Watson, what conclusions do you draw from a woman who maintains absolute silence for 5 years, yet speaks at the moment of her death?" I considered carefully. "It suggests either extreme terror or the recognition of someone from her past. Someone significant enough to break through years of self-imposed isolation." "Precisely. And the name Arthur, not James, her deceased husband, but Arthur. Most illuminating indeed." Holmes moved toward his coat with sudden decision. "Lestrade, we shall require immediate access to the scene. This case presents features of exceptional interest, particularly the question of how our murderer achieved the apparently impossible feat of committing murder in a locked room and vanishing without trace." The hansom cab deposited us before Thornfield House as the November afternoon surrendered to an early dusk that seemed to press against the Georgian windows like some malevolent presence. The narrow facade stood in stark contrast to its more welcoming neighbors, its brass nameplate bearing the green patina of years and its curtains drawn tight against the world's intrusion. Holmes paused upon the threshold, his keen eyes absorbing details that would escape lesser observers. "Note, Watson, the accumulation of correspondence beneath the door. 3 days' worth, suggesting Mrs. Fairfax has abandoned her usual schedule since the discovery. Observe also the slight displacement of the doormat and the fresh scratches upon the lock plate, indicating recent heavy usage by unfamiliar hands." Inspector Lestrade admitted us with his key, and we stepped into an atmosphere thick with the peculiar mustiness of a dwelling where life had retreated to its barest essentials. The entrance hall bore the oppressive weight of suspended time, its walls displaying only the faded rectangles where military memorabilia had once hung. Mrs. Fairfax, a small, spare woman with reddened eyes, awaited us with the nervous deference of one unaccustomed to such official attention. "You enter only twice weekly?" Holmes inquired, his tone not unkind but penetrating. "Wednesdays and Saturdays, Mr. Holmes. I sweep and dust, leave the marketing in the kitchen. Her ladyship desired minimal disturbance." "And yesterday you found the door unlocked for the first time in 5 years?" She nodded, twisting her hands in her apron. "Never once before, sir. It gave me such a turn." Holmes's examination began immediately, his movements deliberate and methodical. He knelt to examine particles of red earth upon the hall runner, touching a sample to his finger and holding it to the pale light filtering through the transom window. "Laterite clay," he murmured, half to himself. Not native to our London streets. This has travelled far indeed. We ascended to the first-floor sitting room where the impossible crime had occurred. The chamber struck me with its atmosphere of frozen time. Mrs. Whitmore remained in her high-backed chair, spectacles perched upon her nose, the dark stain upon her grey silk dress the only violent note in an otherwise orderly scene. Holmes ignored the deceased initially, circling the room's periphery with cat-like precision. The door received his meticulous attention first. He examined the key, tested the lock mechanism, and scrutinized every joint and surface of the frame. No forcing, as Lestrade observed, he confirmed, yet observed these minute filings within the lock mechanism. Recent metal contact, though whether from key or tool, remains unclear. Moving to the windows, Holmes tested each latch with gentle pressure. Securely fastened, showing no signs of tampering yet. He indicated an almost invisible scratch upon the window frame. Fresh wood exposed beneath the paint suggests recent contact with a thin metal implement. The writing desk commanded his attention next. Mrs. Whitmore's final note lay precisely as discovered, and Holmes examined it with his magnifying glass, holding the paper to catch the fading light. Most illuminating, Watson. This note employs black iron-gall ink, yet observe the blotter beneath. With a swift motion, he shaded the blotter's surface with pencil lead, revealing faint impressions. Yesterday's correspondence shows violet ink, Colonel Whitmore, Calcutta. Our dramatic final message represents a departure from established habit. He moved to the fireplace, stirring the cold ashes with delicate precision. Using tweezers from his pocket case, he extracted several charred fragments, including one bearing the remnant of an official seal with traces of red wax. Government correspondence, he announced, or military documents. The paper quality and sealing wax suggest official communication from the subcontinent. Behind the chair cushion, Holmes retrieved the mysterious glove, turning the left-hand leather in his palm with intense scrutiny. Size 7.5, quality manufacture showing recent amateur repairs with waxed thread. The lining bears traces of indigo dye and saddle soap. A horseman's glove, or one who maintains his own equipment. The owner has fallen from better circumstances, yet retains standards. Finally, he examined the windowsill where the red clay had been discovered. His analysis was exhaustive, involving both magnifying glass and careful sample collection. This laterite was not tracked in accidentally, he concluded. The quantity and placement suggest deliberate deposition. A message, though its meaning remains obscured. Rising from his examination, Holmes surveyed the room with the satisfied air of a man gathering threads of a complex tapestry. The evidence speaks of careful preparation, Watson. Our killer possessed intimate knowledge of Mrs. Whitmore's habits, access to her past, and considerable skill in creating impossibilities. The voice heard at midnight, the locked door, the vanished weapon, each element serves a purpose in this elaborate design. As we prepared to depart, Holmes paused at the threshold, his eyes bright with the intellectual fervor I knew preceded his most brilliant deductions. We shall return at twilight, Lestrade. Darkness often illuminates what daylight conceals. The November dusk had settled over Wimpole Street with that peculiar density which transforms familiar London thoroughfares into something altogether more mysterious. Holmes had insisted upon interviewing our three witnesses personally, declaring that second-hand accounts, however carefully recorded, inevitably lost the subtle inflections that revealed truth from fabrication. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell received us in her drawing-room, a chamber rich with burgundy draperies and the lingering scent of lavender water. She was a woman of perhaps 45 years, composed in manner yet betraying her nervousness through the constant worry of a lace handkerchief between her fingers. I heard her, as distinctly as I hear you. Gentlemen, now, she assured us, her voice carrying the conviction of absolute certainty. Twice she called Arthur, and then, with what I can only describe as desperate urgency, "Arthur, please, not again." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his penetrating gaze fixed upon our hostess. "Your husband bears that Christian name, does he not, Mrs. Hartwell?" A flush colored her cheeks. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, Arthur has been my husband these 23 years. "And his profession?" "He is employed as a senior clerk with Threadneedle and Associates, though he once maintained business connections with several Indian trading houses." I observed Holmes's eyes sweep the room, taking inventory of a gentleman's riding gloves upon the mantelpiece and a photograph displaying a man in equestrian dress. "Has Mr. Hartwell ever occasion to visit Mrs. Whitmore?" "Never, sir. She maintained no social connections whatsoever." Our next call took us 3 doors down to Dr. Marcus Pemberton, a spare gentleman with ink-stained fingers and the precise manner of one accustomed to scientific observation. His account proved most illuminating. At precisely 17 minutes past midnight, I observed a brief flicker of light in Mrs. Whitmore's second-floor window, he reported with clinical detachment. The illumination suggested a door opening upon a lit corridor and closing again almost immediately. I also detected a small metallic sound, perhaps a window catch or lock mechanism. "You are certain of the time?" Holmes inquired. "Absolutely. I had just consulted my watch, having been delayed by a difficult berth in Fitzrovia." Constable Meadows, encountered at his usual post near the Marylebone Road corner, provided the final piece of our temporal puzzle. His military bearing and crisp delivery spoke of years of disciplined observation. "All quiet at 5 minutes past midnight, sir?" "Regular patrol, nothing amiss. At 17 past, clear as church bells, comes this lady's voice calling from the upper floors. I responded immediately, but found the house secure. Door locked, windows latched, no signs of disturbance." Holmes knelt beside the curb where we had spoken with the constable, retrieving with his tweezers a minute flake of reddish clay from a crack in the pavement. "Laterite," he murmured, examining the sample in the gaslight. "Our mysterious visitor has brought the tropics upon his boots." Returning to Thornfield House, Holmes made directly for Mrs. Whitmore's writing desk, his movements betraying a sudden intensity of purpose. With a thin blade, he carefully loosened the pasteboard backing of the shallow top drawer, revealing a hidden cavity from which he extracted a flat packet bound with cotton tape and sealed with worn wax. The contents proved extraordinary: a small photograph of 2 military officers in undress uniform, bearing upon its reverse the inscription, "James and Arthur, Fort St. George, 1879," in delicate feminine script. Accompanying this was a visiting card engraved, "Captain Arthur Vale, Bengal Cavalry," and several documents bearing official Indian government seals. "The second Arthur," I observed, studying the photograph with interest. "Indeed, Watson. A man whose rank, station, and geographical history align precisely with our evidence of laterite clay and burned military correspondence." At that moment, Inspector Lestrade burst upon us with the triumphant air of a man who believes he has solved the puzzle entire. "Gentlemen, I present our culprit, Arthur Pendleton, Mrs. Whitmore's nephew and only surviving relative. A wastrel with gambling debts, a documented history of attempting to extort money from his aunt, and a pair of gloves matching exactly the one found at the scene." Lestrade's evidence was indeed compelling. Pendleton had been explicitly disinherited following a violent confrontation, possessed gloves of identical manufacture to our mysterious specimen, and maintained only the vaguest of alibis for the crucial midnight hours. Holmes listened to this recitation with characteristic patience, yet I detected in his expression that peculiar skepticism which emerged when facts arrange themselves with suspicious convenience. "It does indeed fit perfectly, Lestrade," he observed quietly, returning Captain Vale's visiting card to his pocket. "Perhaps a little too perfectly for comfort. Experience has taught me to distrust solutions that present themselves with such obliging symmetry." As we prepared to depart, Holmes paused at the threshold, his keen eyes surveying the scene one final time. Tomorrow, gentlemen, we shall discover whether our obvious suspect is indeed our guilty party or merely another carefully placed piece in a more elaborate game. The grey November morning brought with it a series of revelations that would transform our understanding of the Whitmore case entirely. Holmes had risen early, dispatching telegrams to the India office, the Bengal Cavalry Depot, and several obscure correspondents whose identities he declined to share. When the replies arrived with our breakfast, his expression assumed that peculiar intensity which indicated information of exceptional significance. "Most illuminating, Watson," he announced, passing me a yellow telegraph form. "Captain Arthur Vale, Bengal Cavalry, reported killed in action during the Tira campaign, October 1897. Yet our evidence suggests his recent presence in London. Either the War Office maintains deficient records, or Captain Vale has achieved the remarkable feat of resurrection." Before I could fully absorb the implications, Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of a gentleman caller. Major Reginald Ashworth proved to be a tall, weathered man of military bearing, whose right arm bore the telltale stiffness of an old wound. His manner carried the urgency of one bearing unwelcome tidings. "Mr. Holmes, I have come regarding the Whitmore matter," he began without preamble. "The newspapers report her death as murder, though they provide few details. I fear there are circumstances from our service in India which may prove relevant to your investigation." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite, his attention fully engaged. Major Ashworth's subsequent account proved deeply disturbing. During the Third Afghan War, a substantial quantity of government silver intended for tribal subsidies had vanished from a supposedly secure transport. The official investigation concluded that raiders had attacked the convoy, yet persistent rumors suggested the involvement of British officers familiar with the route and timing. Captain Vale was among those suspected, Ashworth continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Nothing could be proven, but his sudden transfer to Burma and subsequent reported death were viewed by many as convenient resolutions to an embarrassing situation. Colonel Whitmore, as Vale's commanding officer, conducted the initial inquiry and signed the report absolving all British personnel. The implications struck me with chilling force. If Vale had indeed survived and returned to London, his presence would represent a mortal threat to Eleanor Whitmore's carefully constructed new life. Our discussion was interrupted by Inspector Lestrade's arrival, bearing news of Arthur Pendleton's apprehension and a triumphant array of evidence. The young man had been discovered attempting to pawn a diamond brooch, confirmed by Mrs. Fairfax as belonging to his late aunt. "The case appears closed, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade announced with satisfaction. "Pendleton possessed clear motive, gambling debts and disinheritance following a violent quarrel. We found the matching glove in his lodgings, and his alibi for the crucial midnight hours remains unsubstantiated." Yet Holmes received this information with marked skepticism. Has he offered any explanation for his possession of the brooch? Claims he found it naturally. A transparent fabrication. Holmes examined the evidence with his customary thoroughness, noting the violet ink stains upon Pendleton's fingers, the same shade favored by Mrs. Whitmore for years, contrasting sharply with the iron gall ink of her final, dramatic message. The glove proved indeed to be a perfect match, yet something in Holmes's expression suggested this very perfection troubled rather than satisfied him. "We must examine the scene once more, Lestrade," Holmes declared with sudden decision. "There are details requiring clarification before we accept so convenient a solution." Returning to Thornfield House, Holmes made directly for the sitting-room fireplace, his movements betraying intense purpose. While Lestrade catalogued Mrs. Whitmore's remaining effects, Holmes knelt beside the hearth, running his fingers along the cold metalwork with surgical precision. "Watson, observe this minute scratch upon the brass fender," he murmured, indicating an almost invisible mark. "Fresh metal contact, suggesting recent mechanical activity." His examination of the skirting near the fireplace proved even more revelatory. Pressing upon a plain section of molding, He caused a narrow panel to spring back with the tiniest of clicks, revealing the mouth of an old speaking tube running down toward the service stairs. Within lay a short length of gut string and a thin sliver of spring steel, no longer than a penknife blade. "An old convenience for summoning servants," he remarked, pocketing both items, "repurposed by a modern intelligence." The speaking tube provided a logical explanation for the impossible voice heard at midnight. Words could be projected from below to create the illusion of Mrs. Whitmore calling from her chamber. Yet this discovery raised as many questions as it answered, suggesting elaborate preparation by someone intimately familiar with the house's forgotten architectural features. Holmes's final discovery came from the fireplace flue itself, where his probing fingers retrieved a single strand of dark horsehair, stiff and coarse, suggesting recent contact with riding equipment or military gear. He examined this find with his magnifying glass before carefully preserving it in folded paper. "Find anything significant, Mr. Holmes?" Lestrade inquired, still absorbed in his inventory. "Merely confirming certain hypotheses, Inspector," Holmes replied, his tone revealing nothing of his thoughts. "The evidence against young Pendleton appears most comprehensive, yet I confess to certain reservations about accepting so tidy a solution." As we prepared to depart, Holmes' expression carried that peculiar combination of intellectual excitement and moral concern which emerged when confronting criminal genius applied to evil purposes. The obvious suspect had been apprehended. The evidence seemed overwhelming, yet every instinct suggested we faced a far more dangerous adversary, one who had spent years planning an elaborate revenge and possessed both the knowledge and resources to create perfect impossibilities. The widow who spoke to no one had indeed broken her silence in death, but to whom had she truly spoken, and what terrible secret had died with her in that locked room? The morning following our discovery of the speaking tube found Holmes in a state of restless agitation that I had come to associate with cases of exceptional complexity. He alternated between periods of intense correspondence and brooding silence, dispatching telegrams to various corners of the empire, while subjecting our modest collection of evidence to repeated examination. The red clay, the horsehair, and that curious sliver of spring steel received particular attention, as though their secrets might yield to persistence where logic had thus far failed. Our contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Geoffrey Harrington, a thin, nervous gentleman who introduced himself as Mrs. Whitmore's solicitor. His manner suggested concerns extending far beyond routine legal obligations, and his frequent glances toward our window indicated the burden of unwelcome knowledge. "Gentlemen, I come regarding irregularities in Mrs. Whitmore's affairs that cast serious doubt upon the current direction of the investigation," he began, settling into the chair Holmes indicated. "Following her husband's death, she established most unusual provisions in her will. Should she die under violent circumstances, her entire estate was to be liquidated immediately, with proceeds donated to military charities rather than passing to her nephew, Arthur Pendleton. This revelation struck me with considerable force. If Pendleton was aware of these provisions, his alleged motive for murder would have been entirely negated. More disturbing still, Harrington continued, she maintained a private account for what she termed protection expenses. Over 5 years, she withdrew nearly £300 in cash, always with strict instructions regarding confidentiality. She once mentioned keeping the past buried where it belongs, though she never elaborated upon the nature of these payments. After Harrington's departure, Holmes's telegraphic correspondence intensified. Replies from the India office painted an increasingly disturbing picture of Captain Arthur Vale's final years of service. The official report of his death during the Tira campaign proved riddled with inconsistencies. No recovered body. A single witness who subsequently died of fever, and personal effects that were never returned to his family. "Most illuminating, Watson," Holmes observed, studying a lengthy communication from Calcutta. Persistent rumors suggest Vale's survival, supported by unconfirmed sightings in Burma and the Straits settlements. The official position remains unchanged, yet certain irregularities in the paperwork suggest deliberate obfuscation. Our investigation took a more immediate turn when Holmes insisted upon interviewing Arthur Hartwell personally. We found him in his drawing room, a florid gentleman whose genial manner barely concealed a guarded wariness. His military appointments, hunting crops, polished boots, and a cavalry photograph suggested interests at odds with his claimed civilian background. At 17 minutes past midnight, I was at the Imperium Club until nearly 1, he assured us when Holmes inquired about his whereabouts. The porter can attest it. Holmes's attention had wandered to a pair of riding gloves upon the mantelpiece. You maintain your own equipment? My groom is indisposed, Hartwell replied with suspicious promptness. Surely my housekeeping cannot constitute evidence in a murder investigation. Holmes examined the gloves with apparent casualness, noting traces of indigo dye and saddle, soap, materials suggesting contact with Indian military equipment. More significantly, a faint white scar across Hartwell's right knuckle indicated old saber practice, contradicting his claims of purely civilian background. You have never served in Her Majesty's forces? Holmes inquired mildly. Never, Hartwell insisted, though his fingers tightened unconsciously over the telltale scar. In the street, Holmes halted me with pressure on the arm. File that gentleman under requires further investigation, Watson. His denials ring false, and his equipment shows contact with Indian cavalry gear despite his claims of domestic riding only. The afternoon brought Inspector Lestrade with news of complications in the Pendleton case. The young man maintains his innocence with remarkable consistency, he admitted reluctantly. His explanation for possessing the brooch has proven partially corroborated. He claims to have received an anonymous note directing him to retrieve something valuable from his aunt's garden shed. This development aligned perfectly with Holmes's growing suspicions that Pendleton had been deliberately manipulated to provide evidence of his own guilt. Someone had crafted not merely an impossible crime, but an apparently perfect scapegoat. As evening approached, Holmes announced his intention to return to Thornfield House under cover of darkness. Our adversary has demonstrated considerable ingenuity in creating impossibilities, he observed, reaching for his coat. Let us discover whether his confidence extends to revisiting the scene of his triumph. The game, I realized with growing apprehension, had evolved beyond mere criminal investigation into something approaching a duel of wits with an opponent whose apparent death had provided him with the ultimate disguise for revenge. The November night had settled over Wimpole Street with that peculiar density which transforms familiar thoroughfares into something altogether more sinister. Holmes had positioned us in the shadowed recess of a vacant doorway directly opposite Thornfield House, where we maintained silent vigil with the patience of seasoned hunters. The fog retained sufficient thickness to conceal our presence while allowing clear observation of our objective. Our adversary possesses the confidence of one who believes his performance flawless, Holmes murmured, his breath barely visible in the chill air. Such men often return to admire their handiwork, particularly when they believe themselves beyond suspicion. At 11:43, our patience was rewarded. A figure emerged from the mews behind the terrace, moving with the practiced stealth of one intimately familiar with clandestine operations. Even in the dim gaslight, the military bearing was unmistakable. Arthur Hartwell, though his comfortable suburban attire had been replaced by the dark clothing and soft-soled boots of a professional burglar. Holmes gripped my arm as Hartwell approached Thornfield's rear entrance. With movements suggesting intimate knowledge of the building's layout, he produced a set of picks and addressed the service door with practiced efficiency. Within moments, the lock yielded to his ministrations, and he vanished into the darkened interior. We crossed the street with careful stealth, positioning ourselves where we could observe both the service entrance and the upper windows. Holmes had brought his dark lantern, though he kept it shuttered against premature discovery. The waiting seemed interminable, punctuated only by the distant chiming of church bells, marking the approach of midnight. At 11:58, a faint glow appeared in Mrs. Whitmore's sitting-room window, not the steady illumination of gas or candle, but the brief flicker of a struck match. This was followed by deliberate movement within the house, muffled yet purposeful, as though our intruder sought to minimize disturbance while accomplishing some specific task. Then, at precisely midnight, came the voice that had mystified 3 witnesses only nights before. "Arthur," it called, clear and desperate, seeming to emanate from the upper floors. "Arthur, please, not again." The projection was masterful, creating the perfect illusion of Mrs. Whitmore's posthumous plea. Yet we now understood the mechanical reality behind this supernatural impossibility. The forgotten speaking tube, manipulated to broadcast a carefully rehearsed performance that would establish the precise time of the murder, while creating unshakable witness testimony. Holmes's hand found my shoulder as footsteps approached the rear entrance. Hartwell emerged, carrying a small leather satchel that had not been present during his entry, undoubtedly containing the evidence he had returned to retrieve now that its purpose was served. "The final act," Holmes whispered, stepping from the shadows as Hartwell reached the garden gate. The man spun with genuine alarm, his hand moving instinctively toward his coat before freezing at the sight of Holmes's steady revolver. "Captain Arthur Vale, I presume," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Or do you prefer your carefully constructed identity as Arthur Hartwell, respectable clerk and devoted husband?" The transformation was remarkable. The nervous suburban gentleman vanished, replaced by the rigid bearing of a professional soldier accepting defeat with military discipline. "How long have you known?" "The laterite clay upon your boots spoke of Indian service, despite your claims of purely domestic pursuits. The indigo dye and saddle soap on your gloves indicated contact with cavalry equipment. Most significantly, your intimate knowledge of Mrs. Whitmore's habits and your possession of a matching glove suggested not coincidence, but careful preparation." Vale's shoulders straightened with something approaching relief. "She destroyed my career, my reputation, my very existence. For 5 years, I have planned this moment, the perfect, impossible crime that would see her dead, and another blamed for the deed." Using the speaking tube to create the illusion of her final words, while you had already murdered her hours earlier using a thin blade inserted through the window latch mechanism. The spring steel we discovered. The red clay was your signature, the horsehair from your cavalry equipment, all carefully placed to suggest your presence while maintaining your alibis. As we awaited Inspector Lestrade's arrival, Vale maintained his military bearing, though I detected in his eyes the haunted look of a man whose elaborate revenge had brought him no peace. The widow who spoke to no one had indeed spoken her final words, not to the living, but to the dead man who had returned from his fabricated grave to claim his terrible vengeance. The November night had yielded its secrets with the methodical precision that marked Holmes's finest investigations. As Inspector Lestrade's constables secured Captain Vale in custody, the fog seemed to lift both literally and figuratively, revealing the intricate machinery of deception that had transformed an ordinary murder into an impossible crime. The confession of Captain Arthur Vale, in the cold gaslight of Wimpole Street, with his elaborate masquerade finally exposed, Vale maintained the rigid bearing of a professional soldier, accepting defeat with military discipline. His transformation from the nervous suburban clerk Arthur Hartwell to the vengeful cavalry officer was complete, and with it came a confession delivered with the bitter satisfaction of a man whose long-concealed genius had finally received recognition. 5 years of preparation, Mr. Holmes, Vale began, his voice carrying years of accumulated rage. 5 years of watching Eleanor Whitmore live comfortably on stolen silver while my reputation rotted in an unmarked grave. She possessed documents that could have cleared my name, yet chose to preserve her husband's memory rather than acknowledge the truth. The leather satchel Vale had retrieved from Thornfield House contained the final pieces of our puzzle. Holmes examined its contents with characteristic thoroughness, revealing correspondence between Mrs. Whitmore and various military authorities. Bank drafts representing substantial sums and, most significantly, a detailed confession in Colonel Whitmore's own hand, acknowledging his role in the theft of government silver and his deliberate sacrifice of Vale's reputation to preserve his own. The mechanics of the impossible. As we awaited transport to Scotland Yard, Holmes began his systematic explanation of how Vale had achieved the seemingly impossible. The technical details proved as ingenious as they were methodical, representing months of careful observation and preparation. "The speaking tube was your masterstroke," Holmes observed, indicating the forgotten architectural feature we had discovered. "You spent considerable time studying Mrs. Whitmore's rigid routine, identifying this obsolete convenience during your wife's social visits. The projection of her voice at precisely 17 minutes past midnight created unshakable witness testimony, while you had already completed the murder hours earlier." Vale's acknowledgement carried professional pride mixed with savage satisfaction. I recorded her actual voice during previous visits, practicing in my study until I could reproduce her inflection perfectly. The timing was crucial. Midnight precisely, when all three witnesses would be positioned to hear and remember. The murder itself had been accomplished through Vale's intimate knowledge of the house's construction and Mrs. Whitmore's unwavering habits. Using his skills acquired during years of military reconnaissance, he had identified a weakness in the sitting room window's latch mechanism during an earlier survey. The fresh scratch on the window frame told the story. Holmes explained to Lestrade's increasingly amazed expression. A thin implement, inserted through the minute gap between frame and sash, could manipulate the internal latch mechanism. The spring steel we discovered near the speaking tube served this purpose perfectly. The complete deception. Vale's method had been elegantly simple in execution while appearing impossible in result. On the night of the murder, he had entered through the rear service door, whose lock had yielded to his practiced picks, and positioned himself in Mrs. Whitmore's sitting room hours before the dramatic voice projection that would establish his alibi. "She recognized me immediately," Vale continued with grim satisfaction. "Despite the years and the supposed death, she knew Arthur Vale had returned. Her final words were not the performance you witnessed, but genuine recognition. 'Arthur, I always knew you would return.' Even then, she showed no remorse for her husband's crimes or her complicity in my destruction. The murder weapon, a thin surgical blade, had been selected for its precision and concealability. Vale's military training had provided the anatomical knowledge necessary for the instantly fatal thrust, while the weapon's disposal in the Thames had been accomplished during his carefully constructed alibi at the Imperium Club. The frame of Arthur Pendleton. Perhaps the most diabolical aspect of Vale's scheme was his systematic manipulation of evidence to implicate Mrs. Whitmore's nephew. The matching glove had been deliberately planted, the diamond brooch strategically placed for Pendleton to discover, and even the violet ink stains on the young man's fingers had been anticipated and incorporated into the deception. "You orchestrated every detail to create the perfect scapegoat," Holmes observed, with something approaching admiration for the criminal artistry involved. Pendleton's gambling debts, his strained relationship with his aunt, even his possession of similar gloves, all became weapons in your campaign of revenge. Vale's final manipulation had been the forged note in Mrs. Whitmore's hand, written with iron gall ink to contrast with her customary violet correspondence. The burned papers in the fireplace had been her genuine daily letters, destroyed to conceal the normal routine and add an air of sinister mystery to the scene. Justice delayed. As the constables led Vale away, He paused to deliver one final observation that would remain with me long after the case concluded. She paid for silence, Mr. Holmes, £300 over 5 years, as though purchasing absolution for her husband's theft. When I demanded the Colonel's confession and full restoration of my name, she refused. Her precious husband's memory was worth more than justice for the living. The widow who spoke to no one had indeed broken her silence in those final moments, acknowledging the ghost from her past whose patient revenge had finally claimed its due. Yet in that acknowledgment lay not redemption, but the final confirmation that some secrets exact their price regardless of time's passage or death's supposed finality. Holmes's reflection. As we returned to Baker Street through the dissipating fog, Holmes maintained the thoughtful silence that marked the conclusion of his most challenging cases. The impossible had become inevitable through the application of methodical observation and logical deduction, yet the human cost of such elaborate vengeance weighed heavily upon us both. The case demonstrates the dangerous precision that military training can bring to criminal enterprise, he observed finally. Vale's scheme succeeded not through chance or inspiration, but through the systematic application of reconnaissance, timing, and misdirection. The very skills that might have served the Empire honorably, had justice been properly administered years ago. The locked room had yielded its secrets, the impossible voice had found its mechanical explanation, and the dead captain had been revealed as very much alive. Yet in solving the mystery of Mrs. Whitmore's murder, we had uncovered a deeper tragedy of institutional failure and the terrible patience of a man who had spent 5 years crafting the perfect revenge against those who had destroyed his honor and stolen his very existence. The grey November morning that followed Captain Vale's arrest brought with it a brittle clarity that seemed to strip away the last vestiges of deception from our extraordinary case. The fog had lifted entirely, revealing the familiar contours of Baker Street in sharp relief, yet the residue of mystery seemed to cling about our thoughts like morning mist reluctant to surrender its secrets. Holmes breakfasted sparingly and consumed 3 newspapers, with characteristic rapidity, discarding each with the slight irritation that marked his displeasure with journalistic interpretation. "They will have their miracle, Watson," he observed, tossing aside the Globe with particular disdain. "Yet having witnessed it, they insist upon crediting everyone save those who actually solved it. Note how the Standard attributes our success to energetic measures at the yard, while the Globe suggests a fortunate patrolman deserves the glory. Inspector Lestrade's arrival brought welcome news of Arthur Pendleton's release and the young man's subsequent visit to Baker Street. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable. The habitual swagger replaced by genuine humility, born of his narrow escape from the gallows. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began with evident sincerity, "if I remain a free man today, it is because you refuse to accept what appeared convenient. I shall not forget this lesson in the difference between appearance and truth." Holmes dismissed him kindly, though not without a warning that folly invites peril even when crime is absent. After Pendleton's departure, Holmes stood fingering the sliver of spring steel that had played such a crucial role in our investigation, his expression thoughtful. "There remains one final duty, Watson," he announced with sudden decision. "Truth is incomplete while deception still maintains residence in a neighbor's drawing room. We must call upon Mrs. Hartwell." The final confrontation. We found Adelaide Hartwell in the same lavender-scented chamber where she had first received us, though her composure bore the marks of a sleepless night. The handkerchief that had betrayed her nervousness during our initial interview now lay twisted beyond recognition in her trembling fingers. "You have come about my husband," she said before Holmes had spoken a word, her voice carrying the exhausted resignation of one who could no longer maintain pretense. "We have come about truth, madam," Holmes replied with uncharacteristic gentleness. "The parish registers tell a different story than your claims of 23 years' marriage. A union by special license, performed barely 2 years past, to an Arthur Hartwell who offered no parentage and claimed occupation as a merchant's clerk." Her composure crumbled entirely. "He told me his name was not his own," she whispered, her eyes closing as though to shut out the weight of her complicity. "He spoke of injustice, of needing sanctuary until his honor might be restored. He was kind, Mr. Holmes, grave and gentle, a gentleman fallen upon hard circumstances. I am a widow. I took the name he offered and asked no questions that might shame him." Holmes inclined his head with surprising compassion. "I do not judge you, Mrs. Hartwell. Yet you can complete our understanding. Did he maintain maps, drawings, plans of a certain house in Wimpole Street?" Without hesitation, she retrieved from her escritoire a shallow tin case bound with twine. Its contents proved the final confirmation of Vale's meticulous preparation. Detailed sketches of Thornfield House's elevation, notes regarding the speaking tube and service stairs, a rubbing of the key's distinctive bow, and most significantly, a coil of gut string with a carefully crafted knot. "He said the house harbored secrets," she explained, her voice barely audible. "He measured distances by paces, counted doors in darkness. Twice he returned with mud the color of brick dust upon his boots. I begged him to destroy these papers. He smiled and said the river washed away such scruples. The complete technical solution." Holmes examined the gut string with particular interest, testing the knot's construction and nodding with satisfaction. "So the final ambiguity vanishes," he murmured. "The locked door was achieved through this line passed through the speaking tube and secured to the key while he remained within the room. A careful manipulation from below caused the wards to obey, while a sharp jerk freed the loop entirely. The spring steel served for the window latch, and the scratch upon the brass fender marks where the line was drawn taut before withdrawal. The systematic explanation of Vale's method revealed the true extent of his criminal genius. The speaking tube had provided not only the means for projecting Mrs. Whitmore's voice at the crucial midnight hour, but also the mechanism for achieving the impossible locked door. The red clay from the original theft site in India had been his private signature, while the horsehair from his cavalry equipment served as another subtle indication of his true identity, intended for discovery by a sufficiently keen intellect. The broader resolution. The documents recovered from Vale's satchel painted a complete picture of the conspiracy that had destroyed his career and driven him to such elaborate revenge. Colonel Whitmore's confession detailed the systematic theft of government silver intended for tribal subsidies, the orchestrated raid that blamed local insurgents, and the deliberate sacrifice of Vale's reputation to preserve the colonel's own position. The protection money Mrs. Whitmore had paid over 5 years, as revealed by her solicitor, had indeed been hush money, not to Vale, who remained unaware of her survival, but to a former sergeant who possessed knowledge of the original cover-up. This man's recent disappearance, having finally secured a substantial payment, had provided Vale with the opportunity to approach Mrs. Whitmore directly. The matching glove that had so convinced Inspector Lestrade of Pendleton's guilt proved to be perhaps Vale's most diabolical touch. He had purchased identical pairs years earlier, deliberately aging one to suggest long-time ownership while carefully placing it where discovery was inevitable. The diamond brooch that sealed Pendleton's apparent guilt had been strategically positioned in the garden shed, with an anonymous note ensuring the desperate young man would retrieve it. Holmes's final reflection. As we returned to Baker Street through streets now bright with afternoon sunshine, Holmes maintained the contemplative silence that marked the conclusion of his most challenging cases. The impossible had been rendered inevitable through systematic observation and logical deduction, yet the human cost of such elaborate vengeance weighed heavily upon both our minds. The case demonstrates the terrible precision that military training can bring to criminal enterprise, he observed finally. Vale's success derived not from inspiration or chance, but from the methodical application of reconnaissance, timing, and misdirection. Skills that might have served the Empire honorably had justice been properly administered years ago. The locked room had surrendered its secrets, the impossible voice had found its mechanical explanation, and the supposedly dead captain had been revealed as very much alive. Yet in solving the mystery of Mrs. Whitmore's murder, we had uncovered a deeper tragedy of institutional failure and the corrupting power of injustice upon even the most honorable character. The widow who spoke to no one had indeed broken her silence in those final moments, acknowledging the ghost from her past, whose patient revenge had finally claimed its due. In that acknowledgment lay not redemption, but the bitter confirmation that some secrets exact their price, regardless of time's passage or death's supposed protection. The case was closed, justice served, yet the memory of Captain Arthur Vale's methodical descent from honored officer to meticulous murderer would remain as a sobering reminder of how easily virtue may be transformed into its opposite when honor is betrayed and justice denied. The December morning that brought the final resolution to our investigation dawned with that peculiar clarity which follows London's heaviest fogs. Holmes had risen early, attending to correspondence with various military authorities while I completed my notes on what would prove to be one of our most technically challenging cases. The impossible had been rendered inevitable through systematic observation and logical deduction, yet the human cost of such elaborate vengeance weighed heavily upon both our minds. The formal resolution. Inspector Lestrade arrived as we finished breakfast, bearing the official documents that would close the investigation. His manner carried the subdued satisfaction of a professional who had witnessed the complete unraveling of what had initially appeared to be an impossible crime. The inquest was swift, he reported, settling into the familiar chair by our fireplace. Vale's confession was so complete that even the most combative coroner's juror found little to contest. He offered no plea and requested only that certain papers be conveyed to the proper authorities regarding his original court-martial. Holmes attended to Vale's request with scrupulous exactitude. Within a fortnight, the India Office issued a carefully worded memorandum correcting the old record of the stolen subsidies and posthumously exonerating Vale of any complicity in the original theft. Colonel Whitmore's confession was sealed among the archives, where such uncomfortable truths often sleep, while a private letter of regret signed by a high official was forwarded to the condemned man. "The Empire is a vast machine, Watson," Holmes observed when I remarked upon the irony. "Its remorse is administrative, its justice often posthumous." The human consequences. Adelaide Hartwell received us once more before departing London for a quieter seaside town where her husband's assumed identity might be forgotten. Her eyes bore the marks of sleepless nights, yet her voice remained steady as she returned the tin case of plans to Holmes without prompting. "Was our marriage entirely a lie?" she asked with the dignity of one who had learned to face unpleasant truths. "There was genuine regard in it," Holmes answered with uncharacteristic gentleness. "That is not a lie, however false the name attached to it." Arthur Pendleton's transformation proved equally remarkable. The young man who had previously displayed the careless arrogance of inherited privilege now approached life with genuine humility, born of his narrow escape from the gallows. His gambling debts, the original cause of his estrangement from his aunt, had been settled through the sale of personal effects rather than reliance upon her estate. "I shall remember always that appearance and truth are different creatures," he told us during his final visit to Baker Street. "Had you accepted the obvious solution, I should have paid the ultimate price for another man's elaborate deception." Mrs. Fairfax, the faithful housekeeper, received a comfortable annuity through Holmes's quiet interference with the charitable committee administering Mrs. Whitmore's estate. The old lady's tearful gratitude pleased me more than many a florid speech from grateful officials. The technical legacy. As evening settled over Baker Street, Holmes assumed his familiar position before the fireplace, organizing his notes for eventual publication. The case had revealed criminal methodology of exceptional sophistication that would undoubtedly influence future investigative procedures. Vale's methods demonstrate the evolution of criminal intelligence, he observed, his long fingers steepled in contemplation. The use of obsolete architectural features to create impossible effects, the systematic manipulation of witness testimony through mechanical deception, the elaborate framing of an innocent party. These represent innovations that demand corresponding advances in our methods. The speaking tube that had enabled Mrs. Whitmore's posthumous voice would be preserved as evidence, though Holmes had already identified similar architectural features in several other period buildings. What served as convenience for Georgian households may serve as opportunity for modern malefactors, he noted with characteristic foresight. The philosophical reckoning. The technical explanation of Vale's locked room remained a masterpiece of criminal engineering. The gut string passed through the speaking tube had manipulated the door key from below, while the spring steel implement had achieved the window latch mechanism. Each element, the projected voice, the planted glove, the strategically placed brooch, had been calculated to create perfect misdirection while establishing an unshakable alibi. A string, a tube, and infinite patience. Holmes summarized when I pressed him for the complete method. The rest was theater, designed to flatter the sort of detection that prefers coincidence to causation. Vale believed himself an artist, and in his way he was. But art without conscience is architecture without foundation. The first serious scrutiny brings it down. Yet the human mystery remained more profound than its mechanical solution. Vale's tragedy lies not in his criminality, but in his corruption. Holmes continued, his voice carrying unusual gravity. An honorable man, betrayed by those he served, transformed legitimate grievances into justification for murder. The institutional failures that destroyed his career ultimately destroyed his character as well. The final judgment. At the assizes, Vale declined counsel and spoke only to confirm the accuracy of the facts presented. The jury, visibly moved by the circumstances that had driven him to such elaborate revenge, nevertheless returned the inevitable verdict. Before sentence, he addressed the court in measured sentences, acknowledging the murder while requesting that his name be cleared in the matter of the original convoy theft. The judge, grave and humane, could not commute justice, yet the Home Secretary's subsequent minute, which reached the newspapers in due time, recorded the administrative exoneration Holmes had secured. Vale met his end with the soldierly composure that had marked his character before injustice had twisted it beyond recognition. The enduring questions. As winter deepened over London, I found myself returning repeatedly to the moral complexities our investigation had revealed. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had paid protection money for 5 years, purchasing silence rather than seeking justice. Her self-imposed isolation had been penance for complicity in her husband's crimes, yet her refusal to clear Vale's name had ultimately sealed her own fate. She loved her husband after a fashion, Holmes observed when I voiced these reflections, and love will traffic with any coin it can find. It is not for us to strike the moral balance, only to weigh the facts and ensure that justice, however delayed, ultimately prevails. The widow who spoke to no one had indeed broken her silence in those final moments, acknowledging the ghost from her past whose patient revenge had finally claimed its due. Yet in that acknowledgment lay not redemption, but the bitter confirmation that some secrets exact their price, regardless of time's passage or death's supposed protection. The eternal game. The late afternoon sun, having finally broken through London's persistent gloom, streamed through our bay window as Holmes took up his violin. The case was closed, its mysteries solved, yet the questions it raised about justice, revenge, and the corrupting power of institutional failure would linger long after the winter fog had given way to spring sunshine. "The world, Watson, is full of such puzzles," he murmured, drawing his bow across the strings with characteristic precision. "Each one a testament to the extraordinary complexity of the human spirit. And so long as there are puzzles, there will be work for minds that delight in their unraveling." A familiar sound from the street below, the clip-clop of hooves and the rattle of wheels, announced the approach of a hansom cab. Holmes's eyes brightened with the keen anticipation I knew so well, the melancholy of one case's conclusion already giving way to curiosity about the next. "Perhaps another client awaits, Watson," he said, setting aside his violin with renewed energy. "Another thread in the tangled skein of London life ready to be untangled. The game, as they say, is ever afoot." And so concluded the case of the widow who spoke to no one, a reminder that the most impossible crimes often spring from the most human of motives, and that justice, though it may be delayed by years and achieved through the most circuitous routes, will ultimately find its way to the truth. The locked room had yielded its secrets, but the locked chambers of the human heart would continue to provide mysteries worthy of our finest efforts at comprehension and resolution. The year had turned toward Christmas when I set my notes in order and sought from Holmes those final particulars which give completeness to a narrative. Our rooms were warm with the glow of coal, and Baker Street, swept clean of fog, rattled now and then with the brisk trot of hansoms and the calls of vendors intent upon the season. Holmes had passed through his customary reaction of languor following the resolution of an intellectually demanding case. Yet at my request for clarification, he displayed the exact sequence of events with characteristic precision. Inspector Lestrade had returned to us a small brown parcel sealed with the yard's label, containing the narrow slip of spring steel, the gut line, and the crude wire loop which had transformed an ordinary murder into an impossible crime. The final demonstration. A little theatre. "Watson," Holmes said with evident satisfaction, "to complete your chronicle and demonstrate how the impossible becomes inevitable through systematic preparation." He set our chamber door ajar, slipped the loop about the key's bow, and threaded the line beneath the threshold toward the stair. With deliberate movements that emphasized each stage of the process, he demonstrated how a gentle twist at the string could turn the wards from below, how a firmer draw could seat the bolt securely, and how a sudden jerk could free the loop entirely, leaving the door locked from within and the key innocently in place. The speaking tube provided both the means for projecting Mrs. Whitmore's voice and the pathway for this mechanical manipulation, he explained, testing the lock mechanism once more. Vale's military training and field engineering served him well in adapting forgotten architectural features to criminal purpose. The spring steel achieved the window latch through similar mechanical advantage, while the projected voice established precise timing for his alibi. The human resolution. Among the papers Lestrade had returned was a letter bearing the prison stamp and dated 2 days before the assizes. Vale's final communication, written in the neat military hand that contrasted sharply with his earlier desperate circumstances, thanked Holmes for securing the truth regarding his original disgrace and begged that Mrs. Hartwell's peace be preserved. The letter revealed a man who, even facing execution, maintained concern for the innocent woman who had offered him sanctuary during his years of assumed identity. Holmes had already promised such discretion and kept that promise with characteristic honor. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell had departed London for a quiet seaside town where her husband's assumed identity might be forgotten, carrying with her a small annuity Holmes had quietly arranged through the charitable committee administering Mrs. Whitmore's estate. Mrs. Fairfax, the faithful housekeeper whose discovery had initiated our investigation, received similar consideration. When I encountered her during a final visit to Wimpole Street, she curtsied with the quiet dignity of one whose future had been secured through unexpected kindness. "It were never cheerful, sir," she observed, looking past me to the landing where Mrs. Whitmore had maintained her silent vigil for 5 years. "But it were decent. The master and the missus can sleep now, I think." Arthur Pendleton's transformation proved equally remarkable. The young man who had previously displayed careless arrogance now approached life with genuine humility, born of his narrow escape from the gallows. His gambling debts had been settled through the sale of personal effects rather than reliance upon his aunt's estate, and his final visit to Baker Street carried the dignity of one who had learned to distinguish between appearance and truth. The deeper reflections. As winter deepened over London, Holmes and I found ourselves returning repeatedly to the moral complexities our investigation had revealed. The case had demonstrated not merely criminal ingenuity, but the terrible consequences of institutional failure and the corrupting power of injustice upon even the most honorable character. "It is a curious paradox, Watson," Holmes remarked one evening as the gas lamp cast long shadows across our sitting room, "that the more complex the human heart, the simpler, often, the motive becomes." Vale's elaborate methodology was both shield and distraction from the profound sense of betrayal that had festered within him for years. The technical aspects of the crime, the locked room, the impossible voice, the vanished weapon, had yielded to systematic analysis and logical deduction. Yet the human tragedy at its heart proved far more complex, revealing layers of misunderstanding, institutional corruption, and the terrible patience of a wronged man's revenge. The greatest misdirection in this case, Holmes continued, reaching for his pipe, was not the mechanical impossibilities, but the very notion of Arthur Pendleton as our obvious suspect. Vale crafted a solution designed to be too convenient, too neat, bait for the less discerning intellect that mistakes simplicity for truth. The official resolution. Inspector Lestrade's final visit brought news of the administrative corrections Holmes had secured through his correspondence with various military authorities. The India office had issued a carefully worded memorandum correcting the old records regarding the stolen subsidies and posthumously exonerating Vale of any complicity in the original theft. While such corrections could not restore life to the dead, they ensured that history would record the complete truth rather than the partial understanding that had driven Vale to murder. "Justice moves slowly in such matters," Lestrade observed with characteristic pragmatism. "Yet it moves nonetheless. The case will serve as a reminder that apparent impossibilities often mask the most human of motives. The physical evidence, the speaking tube, the spring steel, the gut string, would be preserved in the Yard's collection, though Holmes had already identified similar architectural features in several other period buildings that might serve future malefactors with sufficient knowledge and patience. The eternal game. As our conversation drew to its natural conclusion, Holmes assumed his familiar position before the fireplace, his long fingers manipulating his violin with the absorbed concentration that marked his transition from one intellectual challenge to the next. The Whitmore case had joined the extensive annals of our adventures, yet its lessons regarding the complexity of human motivation and the dangerous precision that military training could bring to criminal enterprise would inform future investigations. "The world is full of such hidden grievances, Watson," he observed, drawing a contemplative note from the strings, waiting for an opportunity to erupt. "Our task is to recognize the signs before they manifest in violence, to distinguish between justice and vengeance before the distinction becomes academic." A familiar sound from the street below, the clip-clop of hooves and urgent voices, announced the approach of what might prove our next case. Holmes's eyes brightened with the keen anticipation I knew so well, the melancholy of one mystery's conclusion already giving way to curiosity about the next. "Perhaps another puzzle awaits, Watson," he said, setting aside his violin with renewed energy. "Another thread in the tangled skein of London life ready to be untangled. The game, as they say, is ever afoot." And so concluded the case of the widow who spoke to no one. A reminder that the most impossible crimes often spring from the most human of motives, and that justice, though it may be delayed by years and achieved through the most circuitous routes, will ultimately find its way to the truth. The locked room had yielded its secrets, but the locked chambers of the human heart would continue to provide mysteries worthy of our finest efforts at comprehension and resolution. The widow's final silence had been broken not by supernatural intervention, but by the methodical application of mechanical ingenuity to criminal purpose. Yet in solving the technical mystery, we had uncovered a deeper tragedy of institutional failure and the terrible transformation of honor into vengeance when justice is denied. Such lessons, I reflected, were worth preserving alongside the more dramatic elements of impossible crimes and their inevitable solutions.